Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of November. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's take a look at the Russian sources map. As you can see, there are a lot of icons all over the front line, as like the endless number of icons, a lot of icons near Piesky, a lot of icons near Bakhmut area, a lot of icons on the Plashanovka front line, Lyman front line, a lot of icons on Kupiansk front line. So we have a lot of updates, and let's start from Kupiansk front line. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made a few attempts of counter-offensive operation in the direction of Yagodne, in the area in the vicinity of Kislovka, Kotlarovka, Yagodne. All those attacks were repulsed, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers and something around 4 armored vehicles. If we're talking about Lyman front line, and when I'm talking about Lyman front line, I'm talking about the towns in the area in the vicinity of Kupiansk. So this is about Zhitlovka, Chervonopopovka, Plashanka, Seversk, Belogorovka, this area and so on. The Russians reported that Ukrainians have collected a lot of forces in the forest on the north of Seversk Donetsk river, and they were trying, using this forest, to get as close as possible to Kupiansk. Furthermore, the Ukrainians were trying to develop their positions around Chervonopopovka and Zhitlovka and these towns, but the Russians reported that all those attacks were repulsed by the Russians, and the Ukrainians lost around 80 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that, according to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians managed to enter Chervonopopovka and to establish control over this town, and this information, we can find the confirmation of this information on the Western sources map in this area, this Chervonopopovka and so on. But starting this morning, the Russians, every single military channel, every single military expert reported that all those positions that the Russians lost during the day before yesterday, they managed to restore, but with one important and interesting note. The Russians were saying that they returned control over Chervonopopovka, Pishane, Zhitlovka, all over these towns. But after all these notes, they reported that from now on, these towns are in the gray zone. So that means that nobody controls these 3 towns, or at least this area, Chervonopopovka, Pishane, Zhitlovka. The Ukrainians don't control this town, the Russians as well. Maybe they have better control because they have a better position, they have criminal logistics centers, they can send forces. But anyway, some parts of this town is under Ukrainian control, and also the Ukrainians have possibilities to move forces in this area. If we're talking about Lyman front line, as I told you, the Ukraine lost around 80 soldiers and something around 3 armored vehicles. As you can see, the Ukrainians have increased their pressure on this front line, and we understand the real reason. They want to take control over Svatova, then they want to develop their offensive operation in direction of Starobelsk. It's the normal military or war situation when one party attacks in one direction, another party tries to attack another direction. If we're talking about the Russians, mainly they're trying to develop their offensive operation in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians understand that they don't need a lot of forces in Bakhmut. The only they need is the number of forces that able to hold the Russian or to slow them down as much as possible. Meanwhile, they are able to develop some operation on any other front line. According to information we have, the Ukrainians decided to liberate or return control over the north of LPR region, and we can understand this because if we're talking about the Russians, don't forget that the Russians have prepared the Wagner's defense line that moves from the south, let's say from Gorlovka. This defense line moves to Privolye and then along the Seversk Donetsk river to the old, let's say, LPR border that we saw before from 2014 till 2022. So the Russians have prepared the fortification, and according to this construction of fortification, maybe they are okay with losing the north of LPR. So it's according to the fortification. Anyway, if we're talking about more updates on this area, if we take like a deployment map, we have one important update that Ukrainians moved their 107th Defense Brigade. So, and this brigade is located right in the back of all the front line of Kupiansk Lyman front line. And the thing is that this is complete infantry brigade. This defense brigade, and I believe that the number of this brigade is around 4,000 soldiers, so we understand that now the Ukrainians have a lot of manpower in this area, and before they reduce the number of this brigade, they will be able to reinforce the mechanized brigades, storm assault brigades in this area, and to continue their offensive operations. So from the end of November till these days, till the beginning of December, the Ukrainians deployed their 45th Artillery Brigade to increase the pressure, and they deployed their 107th Defense Brigade to increase the number of manpower in this area. And now the Ukrainians are able to use this brigade as main forces to storm the Russian position all over the Kupiansk Lyman front line. So these are very important updates, and that means that Ukrainians are not planning to reduce the pressure in this area. Now we are moving to the, let's say, Seversk-Bakhmut front line. There are a lot of updates in this area. One of the most interesting updates that we saw during the day from the Russian military experts, military telegram channels, that some Georgian forces were encircled in Opytne. There was a video confirmation of that. The Russians reported that around 5 Georgian volunteers were killed in this part of the town. Another party was encircled, and now these Georgian forces, at least by the time of middle of the day, weren't able to retreat from this position. If we're talking about, let's say, 6-7 p.m. of local time, there are no more updates about this situation. So maybe I believe that sooner or later we're going to see something, or Georgian volunteers will be able to penetrate and, let's say, to break through this encirclement, or they will be captured and reduced. And don't forget that the thing is that the Russians have special attitude to Georgian volunteers and Georgian forces, and the main thing is that during the first period of this war, in March and April, there were a lot of video confirmation, a lot of videos how the Georgian volunteers were killing the Russians by cutting their necks and something like this. And there were a lot of video confirmation that the Georgian volunteers promised not to take the Russians as a prisoners, and there were a lot of video confirmation of that, how the Georgians volunteers were killing the Russians. So the Russians have very special attitude to these forces, and I believe that they will try to capture them, and sooner or later we're going to see the real update. If we're talking about Bakhmut, during the previous 24 hours, there was one important update from this area. This map shows the updates during the previous 12 hours, but if I increase the range, you're gonna see one important update over Pidhorodne. As you can see, there was an icon during the previous 24 hours over Pidhorodne, the small icon star with like 2 side arrows, and if we open this place mark, you're gonna see that the Russians were saying that this town was taken by the Russians. If you remember, we discussed the battle for Bakhmut for many times during the previous weeks, and I told you that there are a lot of ways how to break through the situation in this area, how to take Bakhmut, how to develop. We discussed about New York, Donetsk agglomeration. We were talking about Klishchiivka, about Ivansk, about the road the town that connects Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. And one of the video I was talking about Pidhorodne, and I told you that if the Russians want to develop their offensive operation and to take Bakhmut, first of all, they need to complete the clearing operation over Pidhorodne, over this area, to create such something like this. And after that, the Russians will be able from Pidhorodne to establish some fire control over this cross. They will be able to establish fire control over a lot of roads. At least they will have some eyes. At least they will be able to see something. And with help of this see something, they will be able to establish fire control over this territory. And after that, the Russians, as soon as they take Pidhorodne, they will be able to start development of their offensive operation inside of this block that located on the west, east, north of Bakhmut. I'm talking about this area. And of course, we know that the Russians have some position on the east, they have some positions on the south, and with help of Pidhorodne, the Russians will be able to start doing something in this area. And to tell the truth, I believe that that if the Russians controls Pidhorodne, it won't take much time, it won't take much energy to take control over this area for many reasons. One of them is there is a river, Bakhmutka, this one, and if we are talking about this area, there are just 3 roads or 4 roads, 4 bridges that connects this area with the mainland. We can send one bridge, another bridge, a third bridge, and 4th bridge, and there is just one big bridge, this one, and 3 local small bridges. And I'm not even sure that Ukrainians are able to use this bridge, because if we take a look at this area, Pidhorodne, I'm talking about this block, you see that first of all the Ukrainians need to cross these fields using tanks. I believe that the weather allows the Ukrainians to do this, but anyway, first of all you need to cross this river. We know that the Russians are very close, and I believe that there are a lot of eyes upon this area. Over this area the Russians controls every single movement there. I believe that Ukrainians need at least 5, maybe 6 minutes to cross this area, but anyway the Russians do have possibilities to reduce their forces while crossing this area. So I believe that the only safe way to move forces there is using this road, but the Russians are very close from the east, and if the Russians, so the thing is that if the Russians control Pidhorodne, I believe that the next week we're going to see heavy clashes there, and sooner or later this block will fall, and after that we're going to talk about completely different situation, Bakhmut, completely different development of the real story in this area. This is about Bakhmut. If we're talking about entire Donetsk area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 50 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. But this, of course, we see, at least the media show us that the Russians have a lot of advances there, their advantage in this area, they have a lot of progress and so on. The Ukrainians have a lot of progress in Kupiansk, Lyman front line. The Russians have a lot of progress there. We saw a lot of reports from CNN, from, I don't know, a lot of Western sources were talking about the losses of Ukrainians in this town and so on. But there are a lot of interesting updates with the deployment process in this area. If we take a look at this map, you're gonna maybe you are able to mention that there is important difference in the area that the Russians are storming these days. I'm talking about let's say Andreevka, Klishchevka, Kurdyumovka triangle, this area. So, or the the main important area during this offensive operation. As you can see, there were 3 mechanized brigades in this area, and during the final update of this map, we see that there is another mechanized brigade that were deployed in this area, and I'm talking about 24th mechanized brigade, this one. There are still 30th mechanized brigade, there is 62nd mechanized brigade, there is 53rd mechanized brigade, and the Ukrainians decided to deploy another brigade, mechanized 24th mechanized brigade. So we understand that now the Ukrainians have reserves, have some reinforcement, and I believe that the next week we won't see any progress, any movement in this area, whether the Russians will plan to attack Klishchevka or Delievka, Bilogora or Dachina. The front line will be stable. According, let's say, the visual front line will be stable, but there are going to be a lot of clashes, because during the next week the Russians will be forced first to reduce the Ukrainians, or to be more precise, the freshly deployed 24th mechanized brigade that located right exactly in the back of Klishchevka on the south of Bakhmut. So there are a lot of job to do, and I believe we are not going to see any progress on this front line. Furthermore, if we take a look at Chasov Yar, the Ukrainians have deployed the 125th Territory Defense Brigade. This is also a very fresh update. So the Ukrainians deployed the mechanized brigade, and also the Ukrainians deployed the fresh manpower, around 4,000 soldiers that Ukrainians now are able to stretch in this area. And there, as we know, their main job is just to slow down the Russians, to fight on for every single building, for every single floor, for every single trenches. So we understand that it's going to be a very difficult trip for the Russians to take control over this area and to attack Bakhmut or Chasov Yar from the south. Sometimes I believe that it's impossible, or it will take weeks before the Russians will be able to reduce these freshly deployed forces. Now let's talk about New York-Donetsk agglomeration, because the Ukrainians, I believe they understand something about this area, and the Russians understand that this agglomeration is very important. And these days, the Ukrainians have deployed some forces in this area as well. And the thing is that the Ukrainians have deployed Free Russian Regiment, Russian Democratic Republic. So as you know, there are a lot of forces in Ukraine who stands on the Ukrainian side, and there are a lot of Russians who fight for the Ukrainians, who fight against the Russian military, against the Russian authorities, and they have created a lot of corps, a lot of brigades, a lot of battalions, a lot of regiment on this territory, and one of these regiment is the Free Russian Regiment. And the Ukrainians deployed these forces in Donetsk. So during the previous weeks, the Ukrainians deployed this regiment. They have deployed in the end of these months the 1st Presidential Brigade. They have deployed 5th Infantry Brigade in September. They have deployed something around 112th Brigade also in September. So this region is also reinforced a lot with by the Ukrainians, and now it's not going to be an easy job to storm this area. So the Ukrainians have prepared. Don't forget about the 40th Military Artillery Brigade. The Ukrainians moved to the front line by the 30th of November. So the Ukrainians are ready. They are well prepared. And the question is, do the Russians have enough of manpower, enough of everything they have to penetrate this area? We'll see. We'll see, and we'll follow this situation. Now let's move further to the south, and we are getting to Donetsk. As you can see, Donetsk is under very heavy fire. The Ukrainians attacked this town. If we're talking about any other front line, we can say that Ukrainians don't count their losses. They don't count Ukrainians to stop the Russians. But if we're talking about the Donetsk, the Ukrainians don't count their artillery shells and everything they have with artillery. They attacked this town heavily. There are a lot of casualties among civilians. There are a lot of people were killed during the previous 24 hours. And today we got a lot of updates from Первомайская, Netailova, Nivolskaya triangle. Netailova, Первомайская, Nivolskaya. The Russians were storming this area. We got a lot of videos from Vodyane, and the situation in this area is almost the same as we saw and we can see in Bakhmut. The only thing that the Russians do in this area these days, they are trying to reduce as much as possible the Ukrainian forces who were redeployed from Kherson front line to this area. And the situation near Bakhmut is very interesting. First of all, the Ukrainians have their main forces, their main base, their main center where they are able to deploy their forces is in this area. It's the area between Netailova and Первомайska. So this is their main base where the Ukrainians managed to heal their forces, to move ammo and shells, to move tanks, to repair tanks. So this is their logistic, the base that's located on the edge of the front line. And using this area, the Ukrainians attacked the Russians in this area. First of all, there is another important area, is the area between these two lakes. Today we got a lot of videos how the Ukrainians were sent their tanks, infantry, armored vehicles, and from this front line the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians in their flank, who tries these days to attack or to complete the mission in Vodyane. So the Russians storm Vodyane, and the Ukrainians they have possibilities to attack the Russians from this side of these lakes, of this river, from this area. They're attacking them, trying to pin down, using mortars and so on. But this is not a very good idea to fight with the Russians using tanks. So for these purposes, the Ukrainians send their tanks from this side, along this road. They cross the river along this small road, or this may be some kind of dam. This is it. So it is possible to cross this area using tanks. So the Ukrainians moved from this area, the tanks on these fields. They know exactly the map of mines. They know where the mines are. They know everything, every single step where to go. And then they goes along this, let's say, water reservoir, gets these brushes, and bushes, and after that they attack the Russians in their flanks, who are trying to storm Vadiano to send some reinforcement. And as soon as artillery starts attacking this area, these forces start to retreat back to Pervomaiskaya. Today there was a video, and the Ukrainians sent some kind of attack group. There were a tank, there were infantry armored vehicles, and there were some kind of air defense forces. I believe it was Buk M1, Buk M1 maybe, or something like this. And during the step back process, when the Russians started concentrated their artillery upon this area, these forces, of course, they did their job. They maybe pinned down or slowed down the Russians who were attacking Vadiane, and then they started the retreating process, and infantry armored vehicles got on one mine and was destroyed. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are able to use their helicopters in this area. Mi-24, they were attacking the Russians or trying to pin down them all over the Pervomaiskaya. Also, they are able to send tanks in this area as well. So this is the one area of Ukrainian attack. Another one is between this like village, between the road and river. There is a place to attack, as you can see, between the village or between the road and this village, so the Ukrainians are able to attack the Russians. And don't forget about Nivolska. This is another fortification where the Ukrainians have their artillery, mortars, and they are able to pin down the Russians. So the situation for the Russians in this area is very difficult. It's very we see that the Russians started the battle for this square around months ago, but at some point of this operation they stuck, and now they can't do any progress because of endless number of Ukrainian forces, artillery, tanks, and so on. As you can see, there are no problems to supply and support this area. Very close to this area is Novgorodovka, Pokrovska, and many Kurakhova. There are a lot of towns that Ukrainians are able to use to move reserves, reinforcement. So there is no problem with anything in this front line, and they are able to pin down and slow down the Russians very much on this front line. So for now, no progress from the Russians in this area. If we are moving to the south, there are still heavy clashes in Marinka. We haven't received any report about this area for many days. But let's see, let's follow. Anyway, sooner or later we're going to receive anything, and sooner or later Marinka is going to fall. We understand, at least I understand this. It's very difficult to hold such a town that located very close to the biggest logistics center, Donetsk. It's like, from this perspective, Marinka is the area that Ukrainians are able to use just for one purpose: to win time and to freeze or pin down the Russians' reserves in this area, because they understand that the Russians need to pay attention to this area. They need to have some forces there, so that this is the only way, because as soon as Marinka falls, the Russians will be able to release a lot of forces, a lot of experienced brigades or battalions that they will be able to use on, let's say, in Krasnogorovka or any other town or something like this. If we're talking about Vuhledar, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made few attempts of counteroffensive operation in the direction of Pavlovka, Shevchenkova. All those attacks were repulsed by the Russians, and Ukrainians lost around 40 soldiers and something around 4 armored vehicles. So this is the story on the ground. If we're talking about Zaporozhye and Kherson, there are no updates. The Ukrainians and the Russians doing some kind of artillery duels. If we're talking about the Ukrainians, we can understand them. If we're talking about the Russians, the only thing that they can achieve during these artillery duels, they can reduce the number of Ukrainian artillery on this front line, because there are no Ukrainian forces, or at least they're trying to redeploy them. The only thing the Russians can do is just to get the Ukrainian artillery and to destroy it. But if we're talking about the Ukrainians, we see that there are a lot of logistic roads that moves from Crimea to the Zaporozhye front line. From this perspective, we understand the main goal of Ukrainians. They want to attack and destroy the Russians while deploying or let's say supporting process. And some sources are saying that Ukrainians are pretty successful in this situation. And that's it about the stories on the ground. Military Summer Channel reminds me that we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.